If these old elven records have found you in some far-off place, leave the name of your city in the margin of the tale, so the chroniclers know how far the echoes travel. And if you would keep walking these hidden corridors of Faerun's past with me, bind yourself to the chronicle and return when the next page is opened, long before human calendars mattered, before Dala reckoning, before the first stone keeps rose along the Sword Coast. The people measured time by seasons of blossom and by the slow, patient drift of stars. They called themselves the Tel-Kesir, and they did not imagine an ending to their dominion. Their realms were not merely kingdoms. They were living covenants with forest and moonlight, with rivers that remembered names, with ancient songs that could be used like keys. In that elder age, elven power did not always look like conquest. It looked like permanence. A city might be grown from branches rather than built from quarried rock. A border might be marked by a standing stone that sang to trespassers in a language older than fear. To later folk, it would seem gentle. It was not. The first truth that gets lost in the retelling is this: the elves were never one people in thought, only in origin. Even when they shared reverence for the Seldarine and spoke of kinship, the great realms had their own pride, their own assumptions about what an elf was meant to be. Some valued restraint, beauty, balance, an artful strength that did not need to announce itself. Others believed the world was a prize for those bold enough to take it and keep it. From those beliefs, crowns were born. A coronal was more than a ruler. In the oldest usage, the title implied legitimacy sanctified by tradition and by the blessing of the people's gods. To name a coronal was to declare that one realm's will should stand above others. That idea could endure when forests were endless and enemies were distant. Then the forests began to feel smaller. The great elven nations spread across what would later be called Faerûn. Proud Arivandar in the north, mighty Ilithir in the south, Mieritar, whose lands sat between and whose very existence challenged the ambitions of its neighbors, and other realms besides, each with a history deep enough to drown in. For a time, rivalry stayed cold. Disputes were handled through envoys, through ritualized contests, through the kind of polite contempt that can last for centuries. But as the centuries passed, the old elven court's authority weakened, and the idea of a single arbiter for all elvenkind began to fade. In its place came a harsher question, unspoken, but felt everywhere. Who decides what the people may become? Here, the southern shadow enters. Ilithir was ancient, rich, and formidable, rooted in the deep green of the south and hardened by proximity to dangers other realms could pretend did not exist. Its nobles were not merely warriors and poets. They were also strategists who believed that survival belonged to those who prepared without mercy. They admired mastery, over blade, over spell, over rival. And mastery has a hunger. At first it was practical, a widening of methods, a tolerance for arts that others labeled unseemly, a spell that forced a confession, a charm that bent a will, a summoning used not for communion with wonder, but for leverage. In some chronicles, this is the era when the worship of dark powers began to seep into certain Ilithiri circles, hidden behind respectable masks. In others, it begins later, as a reaction to catastrophe. What does not change is the direction of the slope. The people learned, slowly, that the abyss does not always arrive as a roaring invasion. Sometimes it comes as an advantage. There is another truth that matters, and it is easy to miss because it sounds like politics. The crown wars were not born from a single battle. They were born from the belief that an elf could be perfected by forcing other elves to submit. When one realm began to speak of rightful rule, the words carried an implication. If rule is rightful, then resistance is wrong. If resistance is wrong, then it can be punished. Midway through the surviving records, a subtle turn appears, like a stain spreading through parchment. Agreements that once invoked harmony begin to invoke authority. Treaties start to include clauses about obedience. Envoys become spies, and the crowning of rulers, once a solemn rite, becomes a signal flare, as if each new coronal is also a challenge thrown across the continent. This is the anchor point, not a sword drawn, not a city burned, a shift in how the people justified themselves. Because once an elf believes their realm embodies the proper future of elven kind, the next steps require little imagination. Borders stop being edges of responsibility and become lines of entitlement. Neighboring forests become mismanaged. Rival coronals become illegitimate. Even cousins become obstacles. Maeritar, caught between northern ambition and southern severity, becomes the clearest mirror. In some accounts, it is portrayed as comparatively open, more tolerant of difference, less eager to turn supremacy into doctrine. In others, it is simply unlucky, positioned where two great powers could not help but collide. Either way, its presence exposes the fragile lie beneath the polite speeches, that these were merely disputes over land. They were disputes over identity. The earliest violence that later scholars place under the Crown War's shadow often looks small when measured in numbers. Patrols vanished, outlying groves razed, roads secured, sacred sites quietly occupied. Yet each act carried a message more dangerous than fire. It said, "We can touch what you thought untouchable, and the gods will not stop us." And that, perhaps, is why the war that created the Drow begins here, before the Underdark, before black skin and burning eyes, before the name itself. It begins when elven pride decides it can bargain with any force, so long as it wins. Some later chronicles place a single name behind the earliest seductions: Araushni, the weaver of destiny, who would become Lolth. They do not claim she forced the people into ruin at spearpoint. They describe something subtler: promises offered to the proud, secrets offered to the impatient, and the comforting lie that betrayal can be made holy if it is done for one's realm. In the first stage of the long unraveling, no one believes exile is possible. No one believes a people can be remade as punishment. The Telquesir have seen dragons and giants and elder horrors, and they have endured. They assume they will endure themselves. They do not yet understand what it means when an entire civilization turns its genius inward, using song and spell not to nurture the world, but to dominate it. That is the newly contextualized truth the oldest annals leave us with. The making of the Drow was not a single curse delivered in anger. It was a slow decision made by elves, repeated until it became a fate. At first, the people did what they had always done when tension rose between realms. They wrapped blades in ceremony and called it restraint. A hunting party lost in disputed woods. A border stone toppled and replaced a few paces nearer to the rival's heartland. A sacred grove suddenly declared off-limits by decree of a distant coronal who had never knelt beneath its boughs. Each act was small enough to excuse. Each act was large enough to be remembered. The old elven court, once the nearest thing the Telquesir had to a shared conscience, found itself speaking into rooms that no longer listened. The court could advise. It could condemn. It could even threaten to withdraw recognition, as though legitimacy could be revoked like a borrowed cloak. But in an age where the greatest realms began to treat tradition as a tool instead of a bond, those gestures lost their teeth, and then the language changed. There is a chilling progression in the surviving accounts, a shift from rite to purity, from custom to destiny. In the north, Arivandar's rulers and high houses, most infamously the Vaishan, did not merely want security. They wanted primacy. They spoke as if elvenkind had a single correct shape, and that shape looked suspiciously like their own court, their own bloodlines, their own banners above every canopy. When a realm begins to talk this way, neighbors become problems that must be solved, not cousins that must be negotiated with. So the crown wars began the way long-lived peoples begin wars, by convincing themselves they are not beginning one at all. A campaign was announced as restoring order. A military road through contested land was called protecting trade. Outlying settlements were pressured to declare loyalty under the pretense of unity. The spells used in those early clashes were not yet the continent-scarred horrors later generations would fear, but they were already wrong in a particular way. They were spells meant to make surrender feel inevitable, enchantments that bent emissaries, glamours that turned truth into fog, curses laid on supply lines so hunger, rather than swords, did the killing. The first open conflicts did not resolve anything because they could not. They were not arguments over rivers or ridgelines. They were attempts to force an answer to a question no elder wanted to say aloud. Which crown speaks for all? As Arivandar pushed outward, other realms found themselves pressed from multiple directions at once, politically, militarily, and spiritually. Allegiances that had once been settled by marriage, oath, and shared reverence fractured under the weight of suspicion. And the moment one realm accepted the idea that unity could be achieved through coercion, every other realm learned the lesson that peace could be lost through hesitation. That is the first meaningful revelation the wars offered. The Crown Wars taught elves to fear elven diplomacy. In the south, Elithir watched this northern fever spread and drew its own conclusions. If the old order was failing, if courts and customs could not restrain ambition, then restraint itself became a liability. The southern realm had always carried a harder edge, shaped by dangerous frontiers and by a culture that prized control. Now it began to admire, and then imitate, the most ruthless parts of northern policy. The records do not agree on how quickly Elithir's shadow deepened. Some sources imply its nobility had long flirted with forbidden pacts and abyssal influences, keeping such practices hidden behind elegance and tradition. Others place the sharper descent later, as Elithir answered escalating threats with escalating methods. What remains consistent is the pattern. The more the Crown Wars rewarded brutal effectiveness, the more certain Elithiri factions treated the dark as merely another instrument. And instruments, once taken up, tend to be played. There is a moment, quiet in the telling, immense in consequence, when the Crown Wars ceased to be a chain of skirmishes and became a cultural rupture. It came when elven leaders realized that condemnation from their peers no longer carried weight. They had crossed the threshold where shame could still be spoken, but not enforced. In the middle of this widening calamity, the elven court's authority effectively broke, not always through a single proclamation, but through the slow, unmistakable fact that major realms acted without regard for it. That was the turning point that redefined everything that came before. Once the court could be ignored, the last shared framework for elven restraint became optional, and when restraint becomes optional, escalation becomes rational. From there, the wars multiplied and tangled. Rival coalitions formed not out of affection, but out of necessity. A realm might ally with yesterday's enemy because tomorrow's conqueror was worse. The people, who had once used centuries to settle grievances, began measuring strategy in seasons. A second revelation followed close behind. The Crown Wars did not simply kill elves. They shortened elven thinking. As the decades and centuries churned, each realm learned new ways to make the enemy bleed without risking its own heartland. Assassins were trained not just with blades, but with theologies, taught to believe their work served a sacred future. Magic was developed not merely to defend borders, but to collapse them. Forest paths that had once welcomed travelers became traps that remembered faces. The natural world, which elves had long treated as kin, was bent into a weapon against other elves who shared the same ancient bonds. If any listener expects the darkest acts to have begun underground, among exiles, they will misunderstand the tragedy. The worst innovations were born under open sky, and still, even amid this unraveling, the people clung to certain illusions. They believed war could be contained. They believed it could remain between crowns and not become a wound in elvenkind itself. They believed that if one realm fell, the survivors could return to what they had been. The chronicles contradict that hope with every page, because as Arivandar's ambitions hardened into doctrine, and Elithir's pragmatism hardened into corruption, another realm stood caught between them like kindling, Maeritar. Its existence was a refusal made into geography. It was proof that elven civilization could take a different shape, one less obsessed with supremacy, less willing to sanctify cruelty as destiny. In a world slipping toward absolutism, merely existing as an alternative becomes an accusation. By the close of this stage of the tale, the Crown Wars had already achieved their most catastrophic victory. Not over a particular city, not over a particular coronal, but over the old assumption that the Telquessir would never truly turn their full genius against themselves. The newly contextualized truth is simple and heavy. The Drow were not created when elves first learned to hate. They were created when elven society proved it could endure hatred as policy, and call it righteousness. Mieritar's tragedy began long before its borders burned. It began the moment the Crown Wars taught the elven realms to treat difference as treason. To understand how the war that created the Drow truly started to take its final shape, you have to look south, past the polished phrases of northern coronals, past the banners and proclamations, and into the older, harder realm of Elithir. In the surviving accounts, Elithir is never described as weak. Even its enemies grant it that. It was ancient, disciplined, and proud in a way that did not need applause. But discipline can become fixation. Pride can become hunger. Where other realms still spoke as if the old customs might restrain the worst impulses of the age, certain Elithiri houses began to speak as if restraint itself was the problem. The war, to them, was not a temporary fever. It was a revelation. Elvenkind could be reshaped by force. The world could be forced into a correct pattern. And if the world resisted, then the world was wrong. That shift mattered more than any single skirmish, because it changed what was permitted in the name of victory. The chronicles become darker here, and also less unanimous. Some traditions insist that Elithir's descent into forbidden practice was already underway before the Crown Wars fully erupted. Hidden behind courtly beauty and the careful privacy of noble estates, others place the true corruption later, as the realm answered escalating threats with methods that had once been unthinkable. Yet even in disagreement, the shape of the story holds. The war did not merely reveal Elithir's darkness, it rewarded it. A realm learns quickly what the world will tolerate. At first, the unseemly arts were quiet, not armies of fiends marching in daylight, but subtler violations that leave fewer witnesses, enchantments laid upon envoys, compulsions whispered through silken diplomacy, spells designed to break morale instead of walls. It is easy in later centuries to mistake these as minor sins compared to what followed. They were not minor. They were training. They taught a generation of leaders that another elf's will could be treated as a material to be shaped. Then the war's pressures tightened like a noose. Supply lines became targets. Sanctuaries became bargaining chips. Neutral groves vanished under convenient fires. And in the space where old ethics would have stood, new logic grew. If the enemy uses every advantage, why should you stop at the edge of propriety? This is where Mieretar begins to appear not merely as a neighbor, but as a challenge to Elithir's worldview. Mieretar's very existence, its alliances, its culture, its perceived openness compared to harsher realms, stood as an insult to those who believed elvenkind required a single dominant shape. A realm like Mieretar implied that power was not the same as righteousness. That implication was intolerable. So conflict around Mieretar did not behave like a normal border war. It spread like accusation. Raids and reprisals multiplied. Not always grand battles, but continual violations that kept fear alive. Outlying settlements struck and left as warnings, roads watched, travelers disappearing into woods that did not give them back. In some accounts, this era is when the first whispers of abyssal reverence begin to stain Elithiri politics in a way outsiders could no longer ignore. Secret devotions, hidden shrines, bargains sought from entities whose names were not spoken in the same breath as the Seldarine. And here the story's second buried truth surfaces. Elven society did not slide into catastrophe because it lacked knowledge of evil. It slid because knowledge did not stop ambition. Around the middle of this chapter in the war's long record, a turning point emerges that changes how the earlier years must be read. It is not always recorded as a single dated event, because elven histories often remember causes more than calendars. But the turning point is clear in consequence. Other elven powers began to treat Elithir not merely as a rival realm, but as an existential contamination. That is an important difference. Rivals can be negotiated with. Contamination must be isolated, purged, erased. Some chronicles describe a moment when evidence of Elithir's forbidden dealings became undeniable. Fiendish conjurations seen too openly, rites discovered too clearly, atrocities committed in ways that could no longer be explained away as wartime excess. Others describe no single revelation, only the slow accumulation of dread until the conclusion felt unavoidable. Either way, the reaction was the same. The old cautious hope that the crown wars could end with reconciliation began to die. In its place came a terrible idea, one only elves could execute. High magic was not just a category of spellcraft. It was a communal act, a concentration of will and art so profound that it could shape geography and history. It demanded consensus among those capable of it, and it carried a weight that ordinary battle magic never could. In earlier ages, such power was associated with defense, with preservation, with the careful maintenance of what was sacred. Now the war invited a new purpose. The very contemplation of using high magic offensively reveals how far the people had already fallen. To even consider it, elven leaders had to accept a premise that would have horrified their ancestors, that annihilation might be a form of protection. And Mieretar, caught between northern expansionism and southern ruthlessness, stood in the most dangerous possible place. It was close enough to the southern darkness to be threatened by it, and close enough to the northern politics to be used by them. Its forests became a corridor for armies, a stage for accusations, a territory whose suffering could be framed as unfortunate necessity by whichever side benefited. The war made a kind of cruelty seem logical. If the conflict is about the future of elvenkind, then any cost can be called a sacrifice. In the shadows of this reasoning, the name Aroshne appears more frequently in the old theological retellings, not always as an obvious villain, but as a presence whose influence can be read in the war's particular temptations. The idea that destiny can be woven. The idea that betrayal is simply a higher form of strategy. The idea that the gods themselves can be outmaneuvered if one is clever enough. Whether one accepts every detail of those tellings or not, they preserve something emotionally accurate. The Crown Wars did not only break alliances, they broke reverence. They made divine boundaries feel negotiable. By the end of this stage, the listener should feel something settle into place with cold clarity. The Crown Wars were no longer a struggle that might end with treaties and bruised pride. They had become a war where one side's existence could be argued as a threat to reality's order. And in that climate, the path toward the descent begins to look less like a sudden curse and more like an outcome elvenkind helped build with its own hands. The newly contextualized truth is heavy, but it resolves this part cleanly. The Drow were not born from a single moment of hatred on a battlefield. They were born when the Telkesir began to treat eradication as a legitimate tool of moral policy, and convinced themselves it could still be called justice. Mieretar was not powerful in the way empires announced themselves. It did not trumpet supremacy as a birthright, nor did it insist that the people could only survive by kneeling beneath one crown. In the oldest remembrances, it is described as a realm of deep woods and subtle artistry, a place where the boundaries between nature and civilization blurred so completely that travelers could not always tell where the forest ended and the city began. That alone made it dangerous. In an age when Arivandar spoke of rightful order, and Elithir increasingly spoke in the language of necessity, Mieretar functioned as an unwanted proof. It proved that the Telquesir could choose a different shape. It proved that elvenkind was not a single doctrine waiting to be enforced. And in the Crown Wars, proof becomes provocation. The pressure on Mieretar did not arrive in one marching host. It arrived as a tightening ring of assumptions. Neighboring realms began to interpret every Mieretari decision as a statement against them. A treaty became an insult. A refusal to take sides became a lie. A sanctuary offered to displaced families became harboring enemies. The war did not merely spill into Mieretar's borders. It taught others to read Mieretar's existence as a threat. South of it, Elithir hardened. Elithir's nobles had always prized control, and the Crown Wars rewarded control the way famine rewards hoarding. The accounts agree that Elithir's methods grew colder and more intimate. Not just battles, but infiltrations. Not just victories, but humiliations. A rival commander enthralled and made to sign a surrender. A sacred grove spoiled so the land itself punished any who tried to replant it. A corridor of forest altered by spell so that enemy scouts walked in circles until thirst finished what arrows did not. And then there are the records that speak of the forbidden. Here, scholars and chroniclers diverge, not on whether darkness touched Ilithir, but on how it became visible. One tradition insists the abyssal stain was present early, hidden within certain houses as private devotion and clandestine bargaining. Another insists it surfaced as desperation, when conventional strategy could no longer guarantee dominance, and certain leaders began seeking allies that did not belong in the world at all. Both variants end in the same place. Ilithiar began to treat demonic power as an acceptable instrument of state. What changed everything was not merely that such bargains were made, but that they started to shape policy. In the telling of cautious scribes, it begins with summonings used as weapons in remote places, away from witnesses. In harsher tellings, it begins with rituals that required more than incense and bloodless words, conducted in hidden sanctuaries, where even the light of the Seldarine was considered an inconvenience. Either way, the war's meaning shifts. A rival realm is one thing. A realm courting the abyss is another. Midway through the surviving narrative, there is an anchor moment that appears again and again, even when the details differ. A revelation that made denial impossible. Some accounts describe a captured Ilithiri warcaster whose spellwork bore unmistakable abyssal signatures, marks not of ordinary arcana, but of powers with older, hungrier geometry. Others describe a battlefield where something was called up that should not have walked beneath the sun, and elven witnesses carried the memory like a curse. Still others frame it as a discovery of shrines and devotional caches, proof that the corruption was not a lone eccentricity, but a network. The specifics vary. The consequence does not. After that point, other elven powers began to speak of Ilithir less as a political rival and more as a contagion. Words like restraint and reconciliation started to sound naive, even dangerous. The moral logic of the Crown Wars completed its turn. If the enemy is corruption, then victory is purification. Mayeritar, caught between northern ambition and southern darkness, became the easiest place for that logic to land. It lay close enough to Ilithir to be threatened by it, and close enough to Arevandar's sphere of influence to be invoked by it. Its forests became a corridor for armies and a theater for accusations. If Mayeritar suffered, each side could claim the suffering proved the other side's depravity. And the tragedy deepened because Mayeritar could not win the war of interpretation. Its defenders could repel raids. Its diplomats could bargain for time. But they could not control what other crowns needed to believe. In the theological threads woven through these histories, a name begins to cast a longer shadow. Araushni, later Lolth. The most restrained chroniclers do not claim she appeared openly to grant miracles in the midst of the Crown Wars. They describe something more consistent with the way divine temptation often moves in elven memory, a pattern of seductions that suited the age perfectly. Promises of control, promises of destiny, the assurance that betrayal is not shameful if it serves a higher future. The comfort that the gods can be manipulated if one is clever enough. Whether those strands represent literal intervention, cultural allegory, or a later attempt to explain how Ilithir's fall could have been so complete, they preserve a hard truth. The Crown Wars trained the people to confuse power with permission. By the end of this portion of the chronicle, Mayeritar stands in a position that cannot last. Its enemies see it as an obstacle. Its supposed allies see it as a problem to be solved. And the idea that Elvenkind might contain its own war begins to look like a relic from a gentler century. The resolved idea is plain and newly contextualized. The Drow were not created only by a curse in the depths. They were created on the surface, when elven realms decided that the most terrible acts could be justified, so long as they could be named protection. In the oldest elven telling, there is a moment when the crown wars stop sounding like wars at all and begin to sound like a sickness in the world's bones. Not because more battles are fought, not because more banners fall, but because the people choose a tool that cannot be used without changing the hand that holds it. High magic was never meant to be a blade. It was the greatest expression of communal elven will, many minds braided into one act, many voices bound into a single shaping of reality. In gentler ages, high magic raised sanctuaries, preserved mythals, guarded realms from catastrophes that younger races could barely imagine. It belonged to protection. It belonged to continuity. The Crown Wars taught the Telquesir to ask for something else. As Elithir's reputation darkened, whether by long-hidden pacts or by wartime desperation that slid into forbidden practice, fear became a currency more valuable than truth. And fear is impatient. It does not wait for courts to deliberate. It does not accept the slow, honorable methods that elves once prized. It demands certainty. It demands removal. Mieretar stood in the worst possible position for an age like that. Close enough to the southern realm to be endangered by it. Close enough to northern ambitions to be used as a justification, and culturally distinct enough to be read as a statement against both. Its forests became contested not only by armies, but by interpretations. Every raid proved a different argument, depending on who retold it. A village burned, and one chronicler wrote, "Elithir is devouring the green." Another wrote, "Mieretar shelters enemies and invites war." A third wrote, "Arivandar profits from the chaos and calls it order." The people began to live inside competing narratives, and that is how a civilization starts to permit the unthinkable. When no one agrees on what is true, the loudest voice becomes the nearest thing to law. There are records, fragmented, often partisan, that describe gatherings of high mages and nobles where the word necessity appears again and again, as if repeating it could wash the blood from what followed. The decision in these accounts is not framed as conquest. It is framed as containment, as prevention, as a grim medicine for a spreading rot. That framing matters because it reveals the moral pivot at the center of this war. The Crown Wars did not merely convince elves that they could kill other elves. It convinced them that they could erase them and still call themselves guardians. Around the middle of this part of the chronicle, the anchor arrives, the choice to unleash high magic in a way that did not preserve, but destroyed. Even the more restrained elven histories do not treat this as a normal military operation. They treat it as a threshold crossed, a line that could not be uncrossed once the spellwork began to gather. The catastrophe that followed is remembered by a name that does not soften with time: the Dark Disaster. Accounts vary in the precise chain of causes, whose hands shaped the final working, what provocation was used to justify it, and whether unintended forces magnified the outcome. Some elven traditions emphasize calculated action by enemy high mages. Others suggest a deadly interplay of spellcraft, a backlash, a collision of powers, a war of sorcery that became too vast to control. What does not vary is the result. Mieretar did not merely lose a battle. Mieretar was unmade. The land itself changed. This is the kind of detail that makes the listener pause, because it cannot be dismissed as metaphor. Forests that once carried living song became mute. The natural order, so often treated by elves as kin, was torn and twisted into something less hospitable, less trustworthy. Places that had held beauty and memory became scarred in ways that lasted beyond any single lifetime, even an elven one. In the ruins of that annihilation, the war's logic revealed itself in its purest form. If an elven realm could be erased by elven hands, then nothing the people had believed about themselves was safe anymore. The Telquesir had crossed into a kind of power once associated with divine punishment and primordial cataclysm. They had done it to one another, and the cost was not limited to the dead. Survivors fled, carrying stories that could not be told without breaking something in the teller. Refugees became living evidence, and evidence is dangerous in wartime. Where they went, they changed politics. They hardened alliances. They intensified suspicion. Some realms treated them as sacred responsibility. Others treated them as inconvenient witnesses, because witnesses have a way of making necessary acts look like crimes. A small but essential revelation follows here, often overlooked. The Dark Disaster did not end the Crown Wars by frightening elves into peace. It taught them that reality itself could be weaponized. It expanded the vocabulary of what was permissible. For Ilithyr, the message was unmistakable. Whether the Southern Realm had already been turning toward abyssal bargains, or only now began to cling to them more openly, the catastrophe demonstrated that their enemies were willing to wield world-shaping sorcery. If restraint had been fading before, it vanished faster after. When a realm believes it faces annihilation, it starts searching for any power that promises survival, and it stops caring whether that power belongs in the world. For the other elven realms, the message was equally corrosive. If high magic could be used as extermination, then every future conflict carried an implicit threat: comply or be erased. Even those who mourned Mieretar learned to think in apocalyptic terms, because apocalyptic tools had entered the war. This is where the war that created the Drow becomes more than a story about one people's fall. It becomes a story about the people's collective failure, because the conditions that would later make divine judgment feel inevitable were not authored by a single villain. They were authored by a civilization that decided a catastrophe could be justified if it could be described as defense. The idea resolves cleanly, and it changes how the earlier parts must be understood. The Dark Disaster was not just a tragedy that happened during the Crown Wars. It was the moment the Crown Wars proved that elven morality could be overridden by elven fear, and that the greatest arts of the Telquesir could be turned from preservation into annihilation without the world immediately stopping them. After the Dark Disaster, the maps did not merely change. The elven mind changed with them. Mieretar's name became something people spoke the way they spoke of storms and omens, an event as much as a realm, a lesson as much as a loss. Where its living forests had once stood, there remained a scar that later ages would call the High Moor, and even that name felt like an attempt to make ruin sound ordinary. Among the Telquesir, nothing about it was ordinary. The wound was personal. Refugees carried more than grief. They carried proof. They moved through neighboring lands with the same stunned quiet, and every realm that received them was forced to answer a question without words. If this could be done to Mieretar, what prevents it from being done to us? The Crown Wars had already shortened elven thinking. Now they sharpened it. An age that once measured consequences in centuries began to measure them in nights. In the south, Ilithyr did not interpret the catastrophe as a warning to stop. It interpreted it as a sign to endure. Here the histories diverge in emphasis, but not in direction. One scholarly tradition holds that Elethir's slide into abyssal dealings preceded the dark disaster, and that the disaster itself was entangled with the realm's growing use of forbidden high magic. Another tradition treats the disaster as the moment the Southern Realm's secret devotions ceased to be private and became openly strategic, because fear broke whatever restraint remained. In either case, the conclusion is shared. Elethir's leadership began to believe survival required powers that other elves refused to touch. And when a civilization starts calling the abyss necessary, it is already halfway to worship. The change did not always appear first as horns and fire. It appeared as doctrine. Certain Elethiri houses began to speak of the Seldarine as distant, cautious, even weak, gods of ancient elegance who would rather watch the people bleed than dirty their hands. In that mood, the idea of a patron who promised certainty became intoxicating. Not comfort, not mercy, certainty. In the oldest religious threads woven into these accounts, this is the point where the name Lolth ceases to be a future consequence and becomes a present shadow. She is remembered as the Spider Queen, but also as a promise that fate can be rewoven, that oaths can be cut, that loyalty is merely a web meant for others. Some chroniclers treat her influence as overt, moving through priesthoods and secret rites. Others present it as a corruption of values that made her worship inevitable. Either way, the effect is the same. The war's spiritual center of gravity tilts. A small but essential revelation follows, the kind that changes how the earlier wars must be read. The Crown Wars were no longer only battles between realms. They had become a struggle over which gods would be obeyed and which would be defied. This was the moment when other elven powers began to treat Elethir not just as an enemy, but as an abomination. It was no longer enough to win territory. It was no longer enough to impose treaties. The goal hardened into eradication, because the fear was not simply of conquest, but of contamination spreading through the people. And that fear, in turn, changed alliances. Realms that had spent long years undermining one another found themselves drawing lines in the same direction. Old rivalries did not vanish. They simply became secondary to a larger dread. Even the most prideful coronals could understand one thing. If abyssal reverence became a normal tool of elven statecraft, then elven civilization would not survive itself. Around the middle of this part of the chronicle, the narrative anchor arrives as a decision rather than a battle. The choice to make war on Elethir as a unified act, rather than as another chapter in a tangled feud. The elven court, its authority weakened earlier, its voice ignored too often, reappears here in many tellings as a moral fulcrum. Not because it suddenly regained effortless power, but because the alternative was unthinkable. The court's role in these accounts is not to invent unity out of kindness. It is to recognize that without unity, the people would destroy their own future. The war that followed is remembered in later scholarship as the Elethiri War, a grim tightening of purpose within the broader Crown Wars. Where earlier campaigns had been filled with shifting coalitions and clever justifications, this conflict carried a colder clarity. The aim was to end a realm before its darkness became permanent. Yet even here the chronicler must speak carefully, because canon does not gift simple heroes. To oppose Elethir was necessary in the eyes of many elves. The methods used in that opposition were not always clean. The Crown Wars had already taught the Telquesir to weaponize the world. They did not forget the lesson just because the target now felt morally obvious. In some traditions, devastating magics and ruthless strategies were justified as containment. In others, those same acts are remembered as further proof that the people had already accepted monstrous tools as normal. The irony is sharp enough to cut. Elvenkind mobilized to prevent corruption, using techniques that looked increasingly like corruption's mirror. Inside Ilithier, the pressure produced its own transformation. Under threat of eradication, factions that might once have competed for influence began to unify around the darkest promises available. Cults did not merely survive, they organized. War leadership tightened its grip. The realm's spiritual life, already strained, began to reorganize around devotion that offered power without apology. And then quietly, a second revelation settles into place. The making of the Drow was not only about punishment, it was about choice under siege. When a people believes the surface world has decided they cannot be allowed to exist, the temptation is to embrace the identity their enemies already fear. The old elven relationship with moon and forest, with gentler art and patient tradition, becomes harder to sustain. New symbols take root. Spiders, webs, secret vows, the sanctification of betrayal as wisdom rather than shame. This is not yet the descent. The sun has not yet been taken from them. Their skin has not yet darkened by divine decree. But the cultural groundwork is being laid with every desperate compromise and every whispered oath. By the end of this part, one idea resolves fully, without teasing what follows. After Mieritar's unmaking, the crown wars could no longer be described as political conflict among immortals. They became a spiritual civil war, and Ilithir stood at its center like a lit brazier in a dry forest. The newly contextualized truth is stark. The curse that would one day create the Drow did not descend into a vacuum. It descended into a world where Elvenkind had already decided that salvation could be pursued through annihilation, and where the condemned, feeling the noose tighten, began to accept a patron who promised them a future built from shadow instead of forgiveness. In the last years of the Ilithiri War, the surface of southern Faerun learned a new sound. Not the clash of armies, but the steady, patient breaking of a realm. Forests that had once endured elven footsteps like a blessing began to endure them like an injury. Roads were cut through sacred places for speed. Watchtowers rose where moonlit clearings used to lie. The crown wars had always been violent, but now the violence felt organized by a single intention. Ilithir would be ended, or the people would never again be able to claim they had stopped themselves from falling. That intention did not come from kindness. It came from fear sharpened into policy. By then, even those elven powers that had spent ages undermining one another understood that ordinary victory was no longer enough. A conquered rival might rise again. A humiliated rival might wait and return in a later century. But a rival that had made the abyss a partner, whether through secret pacts, cultivated cults, or open rites, was treated as something that could not be allowed time. And so the war tightened. There are chronicles that describe the Allied efforts against Ilithir as grimly methodical. Border fortresses taken one by one, supply routes strangled, outlying holdings erased so the realm's heartland would be forced to consume itself. Other accounts emphasize sabotage and sorcery, the kind that does not win glory but wins outcomes. Both descriptions can be true at once. Elves, when they commit to an ending, do not always seek spectacle. They seek inevitability. Within Ilithir, something changed as the ring closed. A realm can survive hardship with pride intact if it believes the hardship is temporary. Ilithir no longer had that comfort. Its leaders, and the priesthoods gaining influence among them, began to speak as if the rest of Elvenkind had already chosen extermination. In that atmosphere, Old loyalties, once anchored in shared reverence for the Seldarine, began to loosen. It was not that the southern elves forgot the gods of their ancestors. It was that they started to suspect those gods would not save them. That suspicion is one of the quiet engines of the Drow's creation. The faith that rose strongest in that darkness offered a different kind of promise. Lolth did not offer the restoration of what was lost. She offered mastery over what was coming. A web is not a shield, but it is control. It binds, it traps, it turns weakness into leverage. In some tellings, her priestesses worked in hidden sanctuaries and then in open halls, reshaping policy from within. In others, her influence is described less as a hierarchy and more as a contagion of thought. The sanctification of secrecy, the elevation of betrayal into wisdom, the conviction that survival justifies any vow. Either way, the realm began to reorganize around her logic. This is the small reveal that changes the shape of the conflict. The war against Ilithyr was no longer only a war against a crown. It was a war against a theology that had already started rewriting what it meant to be one of the people. Midway through these accounts, an anchor moment appears, not always described in the same words, but unmistakable in consequence. It is the point where the war ceased to be fought merely to defeat Ilithyr and became, in the eyes of many elves, a matter of cosmic offense. There are traditions that speak of atrocities tied to fiendish summoning, acts that violated not only law, but the basic reverence elves held for life and the world's order. Others emphasize something equally damning, that Lolth's influence had grown to the point where the realm's leadership treated the Seldarine as irrelevant, and the Abyss as a court worth petitioning. The details shift across sources. The meaning does not. A line was crossed from pragmatic ruthlessness into sacrilege. When a people's war becomes a question of sacrilege, the gods are never truly distant. Elven histories are careful here, as if the scribes feared that describing divine attention too plainly might invite it again. But the sense of it is clear. Above the clamor of armies, judgment began to gather like pressure before a storm. Not because the Seldarine were suddenly angry in a mortal way, but because the choices being made threatened the people's place in the world's intended harmony. And yet, even that framing carries an irony sharp enough to taste. The other elven realms did not approach this crisis with clean hands. They had already used terrible magics. They had already proven they could unmake a realm, as Meeritar had been unmade. They had already treated annihilation as a tool of policy when fear demanded it. If the story ended with a simple condemnation of Ilithyr alone, it would miss the deeper truth the Crown Wars carved into elven history. Once a civilization learns to justify catastrophes, it becomes harder for any faction within it to claim innocence. That is why the Ilithyri War feels like a narrowing corridor with walls on both sides. On one wall, abyssal corruption, embraced as strategy and then as faith. On the other, righteous extermination, pursued with methods that had already fractured the people's moral center. In the end, Ilithyr's defeat did not arrive as a single heroic battle remembered in clean verses. It arrived as the collapse of options. Allies held their lines. Routes failed. Strongholds fell. And inside the realm, Lolth's creed offered one surviving clarity. If the surface would not tolerate them, then survival would be found where the surface could not follow. The Underdark, once a dreaded beneath world of monsters and ancient terrors, began to look less like a nightmare and more like a refuge bought with shadow. Here, another small revelation settles into place, and it is colder than the last. Exile was being prepared before any divine sentence was spoken. The culture that would become Drow society was already learning to breathe in darkness, already training itself to trust webs more than sunlight, already treating secrecy as virtue rather than shame. So when later generations speak of a sudden curse, they miss the weight of what came before. A curse can change skin, it can change eyes, it can change where a people are permitted to live. But it cannot, by itself, invent the instincts that make a new society endure. Those instincts were forged here, on the surface, by a war that taught elves to fear their own reflection. The resolved idea is this: the Ilithiri War did not merely end a realm's power. It forced a choice between repentance and defiance, and the forces inside Ilithir that chose defiance were already building a future that did not require forgiveness. In elven memory, judgment does not arrive like thunder. It arrives like silence. After the Ilithiri War had narrowed the realm's options to ash and surrender, something stranger than defeat began to settle over the southern lands. Not a truce, not relief. A stillness that felt watched. Armies could halt. Spells could be uncast. But the stain that had soaked into years of policy and devotion could not be washed out by simply laying down blades. The Tel'Quessir had crossed a boundary no treaty could repair. They had treated the abyss as a bargaining table. They had treated annihilation as a tool. They had forced the world itself to take sides, and the world had answered with scars. Among the allied elven realms, there were those who spoke of justice as if it were a final cleansing, an ending that would let the people return to what they had been. Others, more honest or more wounded, spoke as if the war had exposed a permanent flaw, that elven pride, given enough fear, could become indistinguishable from the cruelties it claimed to oppose. And then the sacred histories begin to use a different vocabulary. Not victory, not defeat, condemnation. In the most widely preserved tradition, the Seldarine turned their gaze upon Ilithir and found not merely wartime excess, but a spiritual severing. A people who had chosen, repeatedly, to step away from the harmony the gods expected of the Tel'Quessir. Some tellings place Corellon Larethian at the center of that sentence, as the first of the Seldarine and the divine heart of elven identity. Other tellings broaden it into a collective judgment, a decision among the gods that the southern realm could no longer be permitted to remain what it had been. The disagreement is about emphasis, not outcome, because the outcome is remembered by a name that does not soften: the descent. The first reveal of what that meant was not political. It was physical. Not on a battlefield, not in a court, but in the intimate places where a people meet themselves. Mirrors, still water, the pale reflection of moonlight on a hand. Skin darkened. Not as a tan from sun, not as a gradual change of age, but as a mark that carried meaning like a brand. Eyes ignited into hues that could not be mistaken for any natural variation among surface elves. Burning, alien, as if lit from within by a different kind of night. The transformation did not merely alter beauty, it altered recognition. A mother could look at her child and feel the world reclassify them. The curse was not designed only to punish, it was designed to separate. Elven tradition frames that separation as both sentence and safeguard. A people who had proven willing to embrace abyssal powers would be driven from the bright world, where their choices could wound the whole of elven kind again. They would be cut off, made into a warning that could be seen and feared. And in the most merciless reading, they would be forced into a realm where survival itself would become a daily confession of what they had chosen. Here the old accounts offer a second, colder micro-truth. The descent did not simply send the condemned downward. It declared them unworthy of the surface's blessing. Some chronicles describe it as an exile enforced by divine will, an irresistible pressure that made sunlight unbearable and drove the transformed into shadowed places. Others emphasize the social reality that followed. Even if a changed elf could stand beneath the sun, the surface would no longer accept them. The curse made the separation visible. Fear did the rest. Either way, the world above became closed to them. Midway through this part of the chronicle, the narrative anchor arrives, the moment that redefines everything you thought this was about. The descent was not only the Seldarine acting against Ilithir, it was also Lolth claiming what remained. In the theological variant most deeply woven into Drow tradition, Lolth is not a distant figure who merely benefits from the curse. She is the inheritor of it, the one who steps into the newly created void and offers it meaning. The condemned have lost the surface, lost legitimacy, lost the old comfort of shared reverence. Lolth offers a new architecture of belonging, not forgiveness, but purpose, not harmony, but hierarchy, not repentance, but power through devotion. And she offers it in the only language a shattered people can still understand: survival. To some chroniclers, this is the bitterest irony of all. The Seldarine's judgment was meant to prevent a corruption from spreading among the people, yet the act of severing created a population uniquely vulnerable to the Spider Queen's web. A curse that removed them from elven society also removed the last ordinary pressures that might have forced reform. In the dark, with no path back to honor, the choice to embrace the patron who welcomed them began to look less like betrayal and more like oxygen. The descent into the earth became literal. Caves swallowed songs that had once been sung beneath open stars. Forest-bred senses learned to read stone the way they once read wind. The first shelters were not cities, not yet, more like camps of exile and necessity, clustered near water and defensible passages, places chosen not for beauty but for survival. And down there, another revelation emerges. The Underdark did not make them cruel. It made cruelty efficient. Surface elves could afford ideals because the surface offered abundance and escape. The Underdark offered neither. Food could be fought over. Water could be poisoned. Light could betray. Every mistake could be fatal, and every mercy could be exploited. In that environment, Lolth's creed did not arrive as an alien philosophy. It arrived as a method. The world is a web, trust is bait, dominance is safety. The newly transformed dark elves, now truly becoming what the world would call Drow, began to reorganize their culture around what endured under pressure. Secrecy became virtue. Cunning became righteousness. Betrayal, when successful, became proof of favor. Even the memory of surface beauty was reshaped into something harder. Elegance without mercy. Artistry that served power. Devotion measured by what one was willing to sacrifice. Yet even here, the chronicler must not lie by simplification. The descent did not erase everything the people had been. It twisted it. Drow did not stop being elven. They carried elven longevity, elven artistry, elven discipline, elven hunger for meaning. The tragedy is that those gifts, once turned toward harmony, were now trained on dominance, sharpened by exile, sanctified by a goddess whose love was indistinguishable from appetite. By the time the first generations adjusted to the underworld's rhythms, the curse had completed its deepest work. Not the change of skin, not the burning eyes, the change of fate. Because the descent did more than relocate a people. It rewrote the story others would tell about them forever. that they were proof of what happens when elven pride becomes blasphemy, and proof of what happens when a civilization tries to solve corruption with severing rather than healing. This part resolves on a truth that does not require a tease to feel heavy. The Drow were created by divine judgment. Yes, but the judgment landed on a people already trained by war to accept the logic of shadow. The curse forced them downward. Lolth taught them how to breathe there. In the Underdark, exile stops being a journey and becomes architecture. At first, the transformed dark elves survived as scattered remnants, clans and households that had fled downward with whatever they could carry. Heirlooms that now felt like relics from a brighter world, spellbooks copied in haste, blades that had once been worn in court. But survival does not tolerate nostalgia for long. The deep earth does not care who you were under the sun. It only asks whether you can eat, whether you can breathe, whether you can keep your children alive when every corridor might hold venom, hunger, or something older than memory. So the Drow began to build. Not castles in open air, but strongholds threaded into caverns, with watchpoints that listened more than they watched, and with routes mapped not by roads, but by secrets. The first settlements were chosen for water, defensible stone, and the ability to vanish when stronger forces moved nearby. It was not yet an empire. It was a refusal to die. Then the deeper transformation started to show itself, not in skin, but in governance. The Illythiri past did not disappear. It reorganized. The instinct for nobility, for hierarchy, for houses that carried prestige like blood, followed them underground. But the old frameworks needed a new center, because the old center, the surface's shared elven identity, had been cut away. Lolth provided the replacement. Her faith did not merely comfort the exiled. It gave them a structure that made sense of everything that had happened. The surface had judged them. Therefore, the surface was an enemy. The old gods had not saved them. Therefore, the old gods were irrelevant or hostile. The world was a web. Therefore, the web's keeper was the only patron who understood reality as it truly was. And under Lolth's gaze, hierarchy was not an unfortunate necessity. It was sanctified. A small but essential revelation sits here. The Drow did not fall into Lolth's society because they were forced. They adopted it because it explained exile without requiring repentance. In the earliest generations, that meant the rise of priestesses and temples that functioned as both religion and state. Drow houses began to compete for favor, not merely through wealth or military strength, but through proof of devotion, proof measured in victory, obedience, and the ability to endure Lolth's tests without breaking. And Lolth's tests are never gentle. The Spider Queen's doctrine does not promise stability as surface folk understand it. It promises survival through struggle. It rewards cunning. It punishes complacency. It turns distrust into civic virtue. Under her creed, mercy is not a sacred act. It is a vulnerability. Trust is not a bond. It is bait. That is how a society can become functional while remaining perpetually at war with itself. Midway through the chronicle, the anchor arrives. The moment the Drow stop thinking of themselves as exiles who might return, and start thinking of themselves as a people who must redefine what home even means. The Underdark, once merely refuge, becomes destiny. This is where the famous pattern of Drow life takes shape in the canon tradition. Great houses ruled by matron mothers, political life tied to priesthood, and power gained through calculated betrayal rather than open proclamation. It is not simply that women rule and men serve. It is that Lolth's society becomes a stage where authority is constantly proven and constantly threatened, so that the strong remain sharp and the weak are removed. In that design, cruelty is not a breakdown of order. Cruelty is the method by which order persists. Yet even in a web, strands do not all pull in one direction. As the Spider Queen's dominance took hold, other divine names lingered in the shadows of Drow history, names that preserved the truth that Lolth did not own every Drow soul. Some turned toward Faerun, a god of shadows and theft who rejected Lolth's absolute control and promised power through secrecy of a different kind. Others listened to Illustrae, whose song carried a scandalous idea, that the Drow were not beyond redemption, that they could reclaim a relationship with beauty that did not require domination, and that the surface was not only a place of judgment, but also a place where healing might still be possible. Those alternatives did not become the public face of Drow civilization, but their presence matters, because it reveals something the surface often refuses to admit. The curse changed the Drow's circumstances, not their capacity for choice. Even so, the Underdark shaped choices with brutal efficiency. The Drow did not build in isolation. They encountered other powers beneath the world, other peoples, other empires, other hungers that had been living in darkness long before the descent. Every negotiation carried risk. Every conflict carried the threat of extinction. The Drow learned quickly that survival required both steel and diplomacy, and that the safest bargains were often the ones no outsider ever learned had been made. In time, their hidden enclaves grew into true cities, places where stone became art again, where slavery and commerce and ritual all moved beneath vaulted ceilings like tides. The Drow carried elven brilliance into the depths, and that is the most unsettling part of their story. They were not reduced into beasts. They became a civilization, cold, beautiful, ruthless, enduring, and civilization creates momentum. Once the Drow had cities to defend, houses to preserve, priesthoods to feed, they no longer needed the surface to define them. They could define themselves by what they built, by what they conquered, by what they endured. The curse had started the separation, but now culture maintained it. Even if the surface had opened its arms, many Drow would have found the gesture meaningless, because their identity had been forged in the place where arms are used to seize, not to welcome. This part resolves on a truth that reorders the entire tale. The war and the curse created the Drow, but it was the society they built afterward that made Drow more than a punishment. Exile became institution, faith became government, survival became philosophy, and what began as a sentence turned into a self-sustaining world that no longer required the surface's approval to keep breathing. When the Crown Wars are retold by surface peoples, the story is often shaped like a verdict. The Dark Elves sinned, the gods punished them, and the world was made safer. It is a clean arc. It is also incomplete. Elven histories, those written by hands that still remember Mieritar's silence and the taste of ash in the south, preserve a harsher ending, not a cliffhanger, a reckoning, because the war that created the Drow did not end when the Drow disappeared into the earth. It ended when the Telquesir realized what the war had proven about them. The descent is remembered as divine judgment, but divine judgment rarely falls on a single guilty party in the way mortals prefer. In the deeper, older telling, it is also a response to a wider fracture. Elethir's embrace of abyssal power was the sharpest expression of that fracture, yes. Lolth's web tightened around those who wanted her certainty, yes. But the Crown Wars themselves, Arivandar's supremacy, the unraveling of the elven court's restraint, the willingness to weaponize high magic, created the conditions where judgment could be understood as necessary rather than shocking. The people had built a world where catastrophe could be rationalized. That is why Mieretar matters all the way to the end. Mieretar was the proof that an elven realm could be erased by elven will, and the world would not immediately reject the survivors as monsters. The dark disaster did not only kill and scar. It taught the Telquesir a grim lesson in authority. If the world can be remade by your hands, then the limits on your hands are moral, not physical. Once that lesson exists, the only question is whether morality can survive fear. The final chapters of this story are not about armies. They are about memory and consequence. In the centuries that followed, the surface elves did not simply move on. They rewove their institutions around what they had learned. They clung more tightly to mythals and wards. They treated unity with greater caution and greater need. They remembered that pride could become a weapon turned inward, and they carried, always, the knowledge that one of their own kindreds had been severed from them by the gods. Visible proof that elven choices can have cosmic consequences. That is the first resolution. The Telquesir survived, but they did not return to innocence. Below, the Drow did not simply survive either. They adapted with the same brilliance their ancestors had carried under starlight, and they built a civilization that made exile permanent. Lolth's faith, harsh, demanding, and constantly testing, became the central engine of many Drow cities and houses. It taught them to treat struggle as sacred, to treat betrayal as proof of worth, to treat mercy as a weakness that invites extinction. That is the second resolution. The curse did not end the story by removing the Drow. It began a new civilization in darkness. And yet, canon never permits a single, totalizing conclusion, because even in the Underdark, there are dissenting songs. Ilistrai's followers, however rare and hunted, preserve the possibility that the Drow are not metaphysically locked into Lolth's web. Faerun's adherents preserve the truth that Lolth's dominance is not universally accepted, even by Drow. These threads matter not because they redeem the Drow in the eyes of the surface, but because they remind us that the descent changed conditions, not the fundamental elven capacity for choice. This is the third resolution. Drow is not a single mind, even if outsiders treat it as one. So what, then, is the truth fully uncovered, heavy, satisfying, and earned? It is that the war that created the Drow was not simply a war between good elves and bad elves. It was a civil war over what elven power meant, fought by immortals who discovered that longevity does not prevent moral collapse. It showed that the people could commit annihilation in the name of protection. It showed that pride could turn theology into strategy. It showed that divine judgment, when it came, did not erase the consequences of mortal choices. It merely crystallized them into a form the world could no longer ignore. The Drow were born from punishment, but they were also born from elven failure. The surface wanted a clean ending. The darkness banished, the harmony restored. The world did not grant that comfort. Instead, it left the Telquesir with a permanent echo under their feet, an entire people living in the deep earth, carrying elven brilliance and elven bitterness, and remembering, in their own way, the moment the surface decided they were no longer kin. And the final truth is the one that makes the Crown Wars feel like forbidden lore, even to elves who speak of them softly in moonlit halls. The making of the Drow was not a mystery hidden in the Underdark. It was done in daylight, and the daylight did not stop it.